Gerri is one of the most caring people that I know. She is community-minded, and she not only cares about the arts, but she cares about human beings as well.
I have seen her deal with people from the top to the bottom, and she is the same way whether she's dealing with the president of a company, the president of a country, or somebody selling her a hot dog on the side of the street. She treats everyone with respect.
GerriAarons was born Jerry Stone, March 26, 1927 in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. She was the oldest daughter of Marie and Edward Stone, her sister Lila, 3 years younger. Her father was a very intelligent man who studied medicine, obtained a degree in chemistry, and ultimately practiced law.
He never retired, and he was also a writer and a musician. He played the piano, he played beautifully. He was supposed to have been a concert pianist, but his family came from Russia and couldn't let him go. So he could not go to New York to study. And so he studied other things.
Gerri and her father had a special bond.
He was very, very, very fond of me, and also an unusual man in that he rarely punished me. I don't even remember that I ever was punished by my father, or was by my mother, but not by my father. He was a very fine, brilliant man who helped me get through school.
Her mother was a nurse who had served on the front lines in World War I as a battlefield nurse. After the war, she became a pediatric nurse in Philadelphia.
She was in charge of the nursery. She was a beautiful woman, and I'm not sure that she was always happy, but she really tried her best. She was stoic.
Gerri attended grade school at a special school with advanced teachers called Demonstration School.
It was a very special school, and you had to actually pass an exam to get in there, and I don't know how I did that. I was in kindergarten, couldn't have known very much. I loved my teachers. It was really my favorite school, and I think I did pretty well and made friends and thought that it was the place to be.
City life in the 1930s was an adventurous time for young Gerri.
I was able to use public transportation at a very young age, and nobody ever was fearful. Nobody worried about my being out and wandering off by myself. I went to the movies with my friends. We walked through a cemetery to get to the movies, and we thought it was scary. That was about the scariest thing, was going through the cemetery.
This was also a difficult time for the nation. The advent of the Depression impacted many families, and Gerri's family felt the strain. However, 11-year-old Gerri became interested in the events around her and started her own newspaper.
I had my friends writing little articles, which were probably very stupid, but because we were writing political articles at age 10 or 11, we became interested in helping people.
For Thanksgiving, she and her staff of friends undertook a program to help others in her neighborhood.
We collected money and bought turkeys and other food for families who were in need. And we went through the neighborhoods that required help with one of the mothers who owned a car. Not everybody owned cars. She had a big old car. And we drove through that neighborhood distributing these boxes and turkeys.
In junior high school, Gerri was more focused on outside activities than school. She tried the performing arts as her father encouraged her to take up the piano.
I was a very mediocre piano player, and usually looked out of the window to see what the kids in the neighborhood were doing rather than practicing. And I once took tap dance lessons at a private home with a group of young children, and I must have been naughty because she put me in the dining room and closed the door, and I told my mother, and I never went back.
As a young girl, Gerri became ill with scarlet fever, followed by rheumatic fever, and was out of school for about a year. Upon her recovery, she attended a summer camp to regain her strength. Her mother served as nurse at the camp, which enabled she and her sister to attend.
I made a lot of friends, and I just loved being there, loved all the activities, became very interested in sports and found that I was pretty athletic, and then became a counselor, and I was there for a good many years.
She attended Germantown High School, where she was enrolled in the advanced classes.
Had a hard time with some of them, especially the science and math, but my father, being as brilliant as he was, helped me get through school. He was my tutor. And all my girlfriends wanted to come home with me after school for the evening so that my father could help them too.
In 1941, the United States entered the war against Japan and later Germany. Times were difficult for her family.
I had one pair of shoes. We had food stamps. We had stamps for gasoline. My father had a car. We couldn't use it very much.
Gerri graduated from high school in 1944. That fall, she entered the University of North Carolina in Greensboro, North Carolina,
which was a women's college. And I couldn't get into the University of North Carolina until my junior year because they weren't taking women at that time. They only had men in the school. So I went to school at Greensboro for 2 years. I liked it very much.
By her junior year, Gerri decided she did not want to continue on at the University of North Carolina.
The war was over, and a lot of the men were coming home. I didn't want to live in the South. I didn't want to marry a Southerner. And so I came back to Philadelphia to meet a Northerner. And I went to school at Temple University in Philadelphia.
At Temple University, Gerri became active in campus life. It was here that she met a young man named Daniel Aaron. Daniel's family were refugees from Nazi Germany. They had come to the United States when Daniel was 13 years old. In 1944, while he was not yet a citizen, he was old enough to be drafted into the Army and returned to Germany as part of the United States Army. After the war, he returned to the United States and entered Temple University.
He was very active in political organizations, and I wasn't particularly interested, so he thought that I was just a silly social bug, and he was very serious. He was very serious.
While Dan was older than Gerri, he was behind her in school.
When I was a junior, he was just starting school. He was very intellectual, hardworking, and he helped me with trigonometry or some crazy math that I had to take. And he was an economics major, so he gave me his economics notes so I could study from them when I took that course. And we became friends, and I soon knew that I really wanted to be more than his friend.
They soon fell in love and began planning their wedding.
I had about $300 in a savings account, and he had $60. So we combined it and thought we would have somewhat of a honeymoon, expecting to get more money from family, and we did. My mother gave me the choice of having a wedding or getting money. And she offered me $10,000, and I took it.
They did have a wedding, although it was quite modest. The date was December 27, 1948.
We had a dinner, a small dinner, about 35 people, and that night we had a party at my parents' house. My mother did most of the preparation. My father's best friend was the bartender, and we had about 80 people for a wonderful party.
After the party at her parents', Gerri and Daniel took some of the money her mother had given her and went to Manhattan for their honeymoon.
We went to the theater several times. We saw friends, several sets of friends, and had wonderful meals, went out and really splurged. We had a lovely 1 week long holiday.
They returned to Temple, where Daniel had 2 more years left before he would graduate. Gerri became the primary breadwinner.
I got a job. I took care of the household expenses and so forth. And he worked on weekends. He worked as a waiter at catered affairs. and he did pretty well at that. And the combined salaries were enough to manage to get through. We did okay. We lived very frugally.
Jerry's first job was working as a truant officer for the Board of Education.
At that time, they called it attendance officer to soften the blow a little bit. And they were going to try to make it into a social work agency at the Board of Education. And so I started taking social work courses, thinking I'll become a social worker. It never quite worked out because the education system simply did not have the money to create such a position. So I was in the Department of Pupil Personnel and Counseling.
The position was both challenging and rewarding.
I was never interested in little kids. I never wanted to have a child. I never wanted to be with children. But I was, as an attendance officer, I had to interview both the children and their parents. And it was a very difficult job. I was on the street a lot, going to homes, going to schools, talking to counselors, teachers, principals, children. And it was a tough job. However, for me it was good because I didn't have to sit in one place all day long. I could never do that.
Jerry continued working while Dan finished his studies. He graduated from Temple University and then the University of Pennsylvania's Wharton School of Business. Jobs were scarce. A professor of Dan's helped him land a modest-paying position as a writer for the Philadelphia Bulletin in 1952, where he wrote stories about new businesses in the area. He wrote an article about Milton Schaap, founder of Gerald Electronics, one of the first cable companies to deliver better TV reception.
And he loved that young organization. And he told the president that if they needed anybody in public relations, he would be happy to work for them. And they hired him.
While working for Gerald Electronics, Schaap ran for governor, and Dan became involved with the campaign in the PR department. Schaap was elected and asked Dan to join him in Harrisburg, but they decided it was not a good fit for them, as the job would last at the most 8 years. Dan began to seek other options. Gerald Electronics had been involved in cable companies. Dan had been running their cable operation and decided it was time to step out on his own. He resigned from Gerald, put out his shingle as a cable broker, got a listing from a man named Pete Musser, who had bought a Tupelo cable system in Tupelo, Mississippi. In 1963, they met Ralph J. Roberts, a Philadelphia entrepreneur who had recently sold a menswear business. They convinced him to purchase the cable system. However, there was one caveat to the purchase.
Ralph said, I don't know anything about the cable business. I can't run a cable business unless you come and run it for me. And he convinced Dan to go with him. And that's the beginning and the end of the story, because he stayed with Comcast for all those years.
Dan would become president of the cable company and vice president of Comcast. Over the next 30 years, they built or acquired dozens of other cable systems around the country.
It was a new industry, and Comcast really did very well, and Dan helped.
In 1952, Jerry and Dan decided to start a family.
All of our friends were having children, and I turned to Dan one day and said, I think it's time. I think maybe we ought to have a child, because otherwise our kids will be too young when everybody else is growing up. So we started with one. We liked it, decided she was kind of cute and fun, and soon afterwards had another and then another and so forth.
Erica was born in 1953, Jim in 1955, Ken in 56, Judson in 58, and Allison in 1961.
I wanted to start my own tribe. I only had one sister. My husband had one brother, no parents. His parents had died when he was very young. So this was a natural thing for us to want to start our own little group. The first 3 were in 2.5 years. That was very difficult. We were living in Levittown, Pennsylvania. I had no help. My mother was a help. She would come she worked, and on her day off, she would come to help me out so I could get away. And I do remember her driving we had one car, My husband had to drive that car to the train because he was working in Center City, Philadelphia, so we had no car. My mother drove up in her old Chevy, and as soon as she approached the door, I was out the door and into the car, and she was in the house with the kids. She was wonderful. I really learned to appreciate my mother when I had children. She was a fabulous grandmother.
While Dan was busy growing Comcast, Gerri was raising her children. She also became involved in her local community, developing a reputation for her community activism.
I walked on picket lines. I went out to help people get into unions. This was while I had children. So I was doing this as this is my sideline. And while I was doing that, I marched for the farm workers from California with Cesar Chavez, and I loved him. And I brought those poor farm worker people into my house to give them food. They were ravenous, poor things. They lived on $5 a day. And I became interested in politics, so I helped with various organizations and groups that were running for office.
The 1960s brought about social change. Civil rights issues were at the forefront, and Gerri participated by marching in Washington, D.C.
Once we went on a bus with some friends on one of the marches, and the date of which I could not ever tell you, I don't remember exactly when it was, and we were in Washington a second time. My children, my older two kids, had gone down to a march themselves, and so we went later and joined them in the march in Washington, Civil Rights March. I don't remember which one or exactly what it was, and I went to so many marches in Washington. I was helping with the equal rights for women, and that failed, but I was involved with that. And I was involved with, beyond civil rights, I also was involved in trying to prevent the nuclear energy plants from being built, because I had heard and read bad things about it, and so I went along with trying to prevent them from being built.
Gerri also became active physically, developing a passion for tennis and dance.
I loved dance, and this was modern dance. And I took yoga, and I took all kinds of exercise courses that were related to dance technique. And evidently one of my teachers thought I was pretty good, asked me to substitute for her, which I did. And then I was asked by my community center in the county in which I lived to teach for them. Then I taught teenagers.
While teaching teens, Gerri found the mothers who accompanied them to the lessons were inspired to get involved themselves.
So I started teaching adults. And this was first in somebody else's basement, and then I redid my basement into a little studio, and we danced in my basement. And people in the class were involved in other organizations, and they asked me to teach. So I did, and I taught a lot of modern dance and dancercise and yoga all over the city of Philadelphia.
By 1980, Dan and his partners had built Comcast to one of the largest cable companies in the United States, when their lives suddenly changed as Dan was diagnosed with Parkinson's disease. Gerri and he became involved with local Parkinson's support groups.
They were groups of people with the Parkinson patient and the caregiver who came to meetings. We had people come in and give speeches. We did little playlists. We were really working to help the people understand their disease and try to deal with it in a somewhat decent, helpful way. We then started the Parkinson Foundation in Philadelphia. They've changed their name. It's called the Council, the Parkinson Council now. But it's been around for many, many years, and my husband and I started that group. We also thought that the doctors at the Pennsylvania hospital where we saw the doctors, we thought they were really terrific men
When Dan was first diagnosed, the stress of his job and his illness was intense. They knew they needed to get away to somewhere quiet where he could rest and plan his future. Dan was familiar with Sarasota from the cable company they had developed here.
We decided we'll come down here for the month of January, and I was able to get off of work for January also. We came down and we rented a little place on Longboat Key. And we did what people mostly do on Longboat Key when they come down as snowbirds. We played tennis, and we played bridge, and we went to dinner, and we had fun. We went to the theater, heard music. We really enjoyed being here. And I remember saying to him then, when we retire, this is where I want to be. I love the city. And the next year we came back, and we continued to come down here for longer periods of time. He was very reluctant to buy a place until I finally told him that when we were renting for 3 or 4 months, it was going to cost the same as it would the condo fees. So let's buy a place, and we did.
Gerry started to become active in Sarasota while a part-time resident, first with the Arts Council and then other organizations.
There was a party that was being given for some actress whose name I forget, and it was in the Opera House outside in the yard, in their little area. And I saw people there that I had met but didn't really know. It was the president of the Arts Council, the then Arts Council, and one of the members of her board. And when I saw them, I said, I love your organization, and I'm going back to Philadelphia soon, but when I come back in the fall, I'm your slave. They made me their slave.
In Philadelphia, Gerry and Dan continued their efforts for Parkinson's, creating the Dan Aaron Parkinson's Rehabilitation Center at Pennsylvania Hospital to help patients who could not afford treatment. And Gerry helped Dan with his physical therapy. In 1991, they made Sarasota their primary residence. Gerry became more involved with community organizations. On February 24th, 2003, Dan was in Philadelphia and Gerry in Sarasota when Dan lost his battle to Parkinson's.
There was a big funeral, lots and lots of people, huge funeral, and people came back to the apartment, and it was a very sad but rewarding time because I recognized how many people had touched him and how many people he knew who were really very happy to be able to come to see me, and they regarded him highly. He was really a fantastic person.
Gerry returned to Sarasota that March and continued to focus on the arts and charitable organizations.
I am very happy to be involved in all of the organizations that I am now. It's a little overwhelming sometimes because this city is so full of galas and parties and events and dinners that I find it difficult to pick and choose because I want to go to all of them.
Not only has Gerry cared about people in terms of their needs for shelter, their need for food, and their need for safety, but she has also provided programs for children at risk, vulnerable seniors, any population that she sees that has a need. She will always step up to the plate and do what she can to provide those services to vulnerable individuals in our community.
She models the way for pluralism. She brings people together, whether it be through Jewish causes, social services, the arts, healthcare, education. I could go on and on, but you know if there is a reason to help, you'll find GerriAarons.
She's like a tidal wave. She's not a little ripple. She's a tidal wave. So the tidal wave of Gerry is the significance, not each individual act. Though she does each individual act of kindness with real heart and real caring.
She kept her residence in Philadelphia to be able to spend time with her children and grandchildren throughout the year. In 2008, while Gerry was in Philadelphia, she ran into a neighbor in the condo pharmacy.
She was a widow for many years, and I knew both her husband and Gerry. and I was going through a divorce. And we have a condominium that has a drugstore, and I was in the drugstore buying a lottery ticket, and Gerri was in there doing whatever she does in a drugstore.
He scratched off his lottery ticket, saw he won $20, and said, "Oh, I just won $20." And I said, "Oh, then you can take me for a drink."
I said, "Well, I'm going to a jazz club tonight. Do you like jazz?" And she said, "I love jazz," and that's the way it started.
I suppose it was considered a flirtatious thing, but I didn't really think so at the time. But when he said he was going to hear a jazz group that night, then I was interested. I went with him to hear jazz and have a drink.
From then on, Gerri and Marvin became a couple. Marvin, successful in his own right, helps Gerri with her many activities and philanthropic endeavors.
He's great. He's really terrific for me. Gives me a lot of security, a lot of help, a lot of love and companionship. We're great.
She does give an awful lot of money to organizations, to charities, to civic organizations, to artistic organizations. But when it comes to her own purchasing, she likes to buy in thrift shops.
Maybe 10 years ago, we had a girls' weekend in Key West. And we were shopping, and Gerri kind of fell in love with a door knocker, a brass door knocker that was a bird. But she never spent anything on herself. She was really admiring this, but then she just left. And I said to my friend Meg Lauman, who was with us, "Let's buy that for Gerri's birthday." And Meg said, "Did you ever see Gerri buy anything for herself? Let's encourage her to get the door knocker. She loves it." So we did. And I noticed that it's easier for Gerri to support an organization with a check to help people than it is to buy something for herself.
It is really true. And there is something about the way I feel about my life and my family's that I think, I don't know how to express it well, but I think that my feeling is I don't really need a lot. I have a lot. I have everything I could possibly want. And yet I don't do anything that's flashy. I know I do not have the kind of items that a lot of people have that are expensive and flashy. And I don't really care about those things. I mean, I like to be comfortable, but I don't need anything beyond comfort.
We asked GerriAarons her advice for those who follow.
There is a quote that I would like to repeat, if I can get it right. If you don't have charity in your heart, you have the worst kind of heart trouble.